Welcome back to History 102. In this module, we're going to cover the Industrial Revolution. So, the book does a really nice job on covering a lot of the different topics that are taking place during this period. But this lecture will kind of focus in the pre industrial revolution period, just to give you a little bit of context and to show you how all these things came about, right? When we cover the Industrial Revolution, it talks about many aspects, not just the technological innovations, but the way it begins to shape people's lives, and the way it transforms them, really, in many different ways. So it's difficult to decide what to talk about because there is so much, and there's some things that I'm just not going to be able to cover. But again, I think the book does a nice job in addressing many of those subjects. Maybe I'll briefly touch on them just because I think they do play an important role. But we're going to focus really in the pre-period, but also maybe barely touch on some of the aspects of the Industrial Revolution that begin to impact society and really technology and really transform society during the 1800s. So when we talk about the Industrial Revolution, we're talking about a large period of time. It's not a revolution like the American Revolution or French Revolution, which are, within a decade, right? Maybe even less, take place and then they're over and then something emerges from it. This is something that some people can argue, is a almost 1,000-year process. Some historians, really kind of focus it between the 1700s, late 1700s to the early 1800s, and many of them call that like the first phase of the Industrial Revolution, really taking shape in England. And then there's other historians that touch on the post 1850 period and into the early 1920, pre World War One period, and there we see the focus kind of shift to Germany. So we're going to really kind of touch more on England, partly because the book does it, but that's where it kind of really begins to take off in the 1700s. But more importantly, in this lecture, we're going to really focus before the Industrial Revolution itself, at least the period pre 1700s. All right, and we're going to look at how the industries of the Middle Ages and the Renaissance, the after the year 1000, really influence, if not shape, the Industrial Revolution. The things that are happening before the Industrial Revolution have a major impact on people from Europe, from European, in their lives. So we see how there's a major transformation in not only technological advances, but also the desires of many Europeans during this era. And a lot of it has to do with the way Europeans begin to leave the continent and reach these, what they would consider exotic places, not only to explore new territory, but also to exploit the resources around these places. So, they begin to go to the Americas, to China, to India, right, to Africa. And all these things are interconnected because the Europeans get a taste of things that they have never experienced. And a simple example of that is just thinking about European food today, right? Today we use words like authentic Italian food, and obviously certain images emerge, right? Such as pasta and tomato sauce and pizza and whatever it may be, but those are fairly new creations that were created in the in this kind of post Renaissance period, and a lot of it has to do because of the age of exploration when they begin to access some of these goods that Europe had never encountered before. If you ever look at recipe books of the Middle Ages, before they go to the Americas and so forth, it's pretty disgusting food. So after the Renaissance, things like chocolate and sugar and tomato and potatoes, all these things that we now consider European, are brought over from the New World. and along with other things that we'll talk about. So, by looking at the pre-industrial revolution periods, it really gives us a glimpse as to how this took off by the 1700s. So a lot of it is connected to simple things like food, right? Like I mentioned earlier, again, some of the the diet of Europeans was not only disgusting, but it just wasn't nutritious. After that, it begins to transform after the 1400s because of the goods that are coming in. In addition, we see really how the textile industry begins to shape people's lives. So, I'll talk a little bit later about this, but, just imagine having multiple pieces of clothing to wear, right? Where not only do you have them, but you can afford them, right? Well, all this is a process to get to that point. So the Industrial Revolution is heavily indebted to the industries that came before it. So, some historians talk about, again, this kind of 1700 period as the Industrial Revolution, but others can probably look at it as a vast amount of time of this revolution taking shape. You could almost picture 1,000 years worth of time of this happening. So that's what we're going to examine in this lecture. And lastly, we're going to look really at Great Britain, partly because the book does this, but also, just a lot of innovation emerges from there. Really, England is the place where everything comes together at the right time. And that is important to know. There are certain times in history where certain things exist, but they don't have all the resources needed to build it. And just to give you a generic example, if we all today we live off iPhones and tablets and things like that, right? And everything came together about less than a decade ago, right? That all the right materials to make the iPhone happen at the right time. So it wasn't only Steve Jobs, right, that created this iPhone and this tech innovation and revolution, if you will, right? But that there's these resources available that allow for this to happen. So I'm not sure if anybody here follows technology, but you might remember the Apple Newton. I think it was called Apple Newton. It's back in the early 90s, which is essentially like a PDA. And the idea that it would function like an iPhone today, but the technology just wasn't there. Everything from the battery to the screen, right? To the plastics, they just were not ready for it yet. Not that society wasn't ready for it, but the technology just wasn't there, right? This is the same thing that's happening here, is that in England, everything seems to fall together at the right place at the right time. And this is why England becomes such a dominant power in the 1800s, right? Late 1700s, early 1800s. So this is why we focus there. And we're going to talk at the end about Crystal Palace right here. So let's go back. As a historian, I always like to joke, in order to understand anything that's happening today, you have to go back to the Middle Ages. And I always joke like this with my wife. And she always says, "Oh, shut up with that already." But to me, it always rings true where, yeah, we do have to go back to the Middle Ages. And by the Middle Ages, here we're talking about the High Middle Ages, roughly around the year 1000 to about 1300, okay? So there are certain things that are happening during this period that are very important to the development of what happens later. So prior to the year 1000, most people are, again, this is very generic. I'm sure if there's a historian out there listening to this, they'll probably fault me on this, but again, we're talking very generically, and we're looking at a very large picture here. But for the most part, prior to the year 1000, 1,000 years ago, most people kind of struggle to survive. There's not a lot of innovation, at least major innovation. There's no concept of private property. Most people are dependent on somebody else to survive, such as lords. And most people tend to be serfs, and they tend to live in very small villages, populations of a couple thousand, nothing beyond that. So in about the year 1000, there happens to be a major transformation. I was just watching a video of how the climate, the temperature is rising in different places. And if you watch 60 Minutes, they had this on there about how it's getting too hot to plant certain grapes in France, particularly in the Champagne region, where they're not yielding the way they used to. So it's getting too hot to make champagne. It's kind of impacting the global supply, particularly for this year as I speak right now. The point is that the Earth is getting a little bit warmer, so that temperature that used to be fairly normal in places like Champagne has now shifted to England. So now England is producing better champagne than champagne, right? I think they call it sparkling wine because they don't have the right to call it. They don't have the right to call it champagne. Only champagne that comes from Champagne can have that label. It's like tequila, right? So the point that I'm trying to make is a connection from the present to the past, where in Europe, about the year 1000, give or take, the climate started to get a little bit warmer. Now, this impacts Europe because as the climate gets warmer, it means more people can plant food in these different places, such as Germany, England, and France, which is really the focus of our course. Other things that are taking place are the maybe 100 years after the Crusades take place. So at this time, even though this is a European class, the important places of the world about the year 1000 was not Europe, but the Mediterranean. And here we're talking Constantinople by Turkey and Greece, somewhere between there. We're talking Israel, right? We're talking a little bit of the Middle East. That's what was important at that time. So today, maybe very kind of equivalent. Think of today United States thinks we're like the dominant power, and then you have all these other little countries. So something I don't know, it's just some little country that we might not think too much about, right? That was Europe at that time. It wasn't that important, in other words, right? And you have these other regions that are much more important. Well, around the 11th, 12th century, you have these conflicts called the Crusades, where basically the Emperor of Constantinople, again by Turkey and Greece over there in Istanbul today, needed help because Muslims were attacking his territories. So he calls on the Pope to send some help. And the Pope goes around Europe asking for people to go to the Middle East to help in this conflict, and people do go and fight some of these conflicts. But what ends up happening, at least what's important to us, is that the Crusades opens up a new market for the Europeans. The Italian states are the ones who profit the most. Cities like Venice are transporting people to the Middle East, and they're taking not only people but some of the goods that are found in Italy or around the region, such as wine and grain and timber, and they take it over there along with people. But on the way back, they bring back goods too, such as silk and different types of cloth. So other things that they bring are like things like sugar and spices. These are things that are unheard of in the rest of the continent, in places like France and Germany and England. So, the Crusades really opens up a market. So yes, it's a conflict, a religious, political conflict, but it's also an economic conflict where, no, not so much conflict, but a place where people can actually profit from it. And the Italian states did it the best. really opened up a new market for many Europeans to get goods that they'd never experienced before. So, by doing so, we begin to see really the birth of capitalism take shape during this period. In Champagne, I talked about Champagne a little while ago. In Champagne, there are fairs that are being held. Kind of think of maybe like farmers markets, but in a massive scale, where all these groups come together. And Champagne is kind of centrally located in Europe. We have people from Spain and Germany and England and Italy, come and bring their goods and they began to trade with other people, right? And again, some of these goods are so exotic to them that they develop a taste for them. And this really helps spur in what we know today as capitalism. And there's a lot more happening there too. But we're not gonna touch on every different aspects of how the market develops in the Middle Ages, but also things that again, when we think of the Middle Ages, we think of the Middle Ages as very kind of small town, very local economy, and it's quite the opposite. You begin to see trade in a global scale from that period taking place. So not only do they develop, this trade for goods, but different systems of economics are developed too, such as, double entry accounting. So if you're an accountant major, right, that's something that's very important to the field. There's something called the bill of exchange, which is essentially a credit system in the Middle Ages, right? It's not a credit card, but it's like a credit system, because a lot of times they're transporting large quantities of these goods that it's hard to just say, okay, here's the money, and then try to take that money back to wherever you came from, because you might be robbed, right? So instead you get a piece of paper, which is essentially like money, more like a credit card. But, again, it's something that has value, that's moving away from the way we think of, money in the Middle Ages, of coins, right? Gold and silver coins and things like that. But rather it's a piece of paper that has value. So again, this is a major economic development that's taking shape during this period. Other things that are kind of shifting during this period. So again, if the early Middle Ages, pre-1000, was about small villages and people just very kind of local, after the year 1000, we begin to see the rise of towns. Most towns were located by castles. A lot of times, right, castles were the ones that protected the community. But they're also, castles were located by trade routes, because, merchants brought money to the area. So everything from taxation, right, to having resources was beneficial to a lord during this time. Words like borough and burg are directly connected to the Middle Ages, that have this idea of a community that's next to a fortress, right, that kind of protects them. And in doing so, it begins to grow commerce, right? The Vikings are no longer a threat. Society and cities are growing, or at least towns are growing. And we have that, again, that word borough and burg really kind of relate to this new class that's emerging, which is what we define today as the middle class. So instead of being a serf, somebody who is tied to the land, like this poor guy is, right, we begin to see a new class emerge called the bourgeois, right? It's a French term. And we see the beginnings of that happening in the Middle Ages. And this is important because in the Middle Ages, you have people like these serfs that are essentially tied to a lord. They can't do anything without the permission of the lord. They can't just one day say, I quit, and they move away, right? That's just not something that happened during this period, because they're dependent on their lord to provide, the land that they work, but they also have to reciprocate by providing certain resources to them and certain taxes to the lord. With the bourgeois, or middle class, things begin to change, where they develop these towns and develop freedoms unheard of for many of these people during this period. a lot of times they're not serfs. Rather, they're kind of like free people, but they have to pay for this freedom, where they have their own laws. They have to petition to a lord for these things, and basically had to pay for these freedoms. And this is beneficial for kings too, because they get money this way. And they also develop charters where the king basically gives them their blessing to develop their own towns. And these towns become almost independent of the king's territory, though they're still connected to it, but they develop almost like city councils where they're the ones who are actually running the city. Again, this is important because we see how in the 1700s we go from a society that really looks up to the middle class. They're the ones who govern, who rule the community. So how did we go from that, from the Middle Ages where people are serfs, to all of a sudden having the middle class really having the upper hand in government? Well, it's happening during the Middle Ages. And in different places, we see how, particularly by the 14th century, where you have the establishment in places like Italy of republics, right? Republics, basically, it's kind of like the United States, right? Where the people kind of govern, not all people, but those people in power. And in Florence, for example, you have a group of the population called the Popolo Grasso, and these were mostly wealthy merchants, or part of the industrial class in Florence, who govern the town. So they're not kings, right? They're not born into nobility, but rather these are people with a lot of money who are controlling the city. So just to give you definition, the Popolo Grasso, the definition is fat people, which refers to the idea that they have a lot of wealth. And then I think in Florence you do have people from the lower classes, from the guilds, and even from the working class, that do have a voice for a short period of time in a place like Florence. So what we begin to see is this idea of people leaving this concept of the feudal system into a more industrial system. Not quite the Industrial Revolution, but this is the beginnings of that. Another thing that we see during this period are the guilds, right? I have it, see the term there. And guilds, a lot of people try to define them as unions. They're not unions. Basically, these are people who know a craft, who, let's take, for example, shoemakers, right? Somebody who can make a shoe, they probably know how to make it from its raw material to its final product and be able to complete every step that it takes to make that shoe. That would change later with the Industrial Revolution, but again, we see that shift where people are making products, selling them, and getting money for it, which is an element of capitalism, right? And really what will become the Industrial Revolution. Guilds are important because we'll see them in the Industrial Revolution, where they begin to kind of lose that power that they once had, thanks to the machines that are replacing them. But during this time, again, these are not people that are working the land, but rather rather have a skill in order to create something, right? And the example that we use is a shoe. I think most of us probably wouldn't know where to start if I gave you all this raw material, right? If I were to take you a bunch of raw leather and say, make me a shoe, you probably wouldn't know where to start, right? I'm sure you could come up with something, but it wouldn't be a good looking shoe, right? And we talked about the bourgeois class, right? The middle class. So I won't beat this, this dead horse here, but the bourgeois class, again, they're the ones who begin to have a more important voice, particularly by the Renaissance period. People like the Medicis, and even prior to the 15th century, you have things that are called like the super companies, where they're engaging in very kind of global in the European sense, right? Only in Europe, distribution of goods And if you look at the companies, I mean, these are big companies of the Middle Ages. Most of them are Italian. They resemble corporations today. It's almost like a replica, and they dealt in wool and in banking. They gave loans to the King of England and to different people, and it just kind of goes to show how by the 1300s you do have these big industries and even companies, which is something that we typically don't associate with this era, because we tend to think of them in this way. People just working land and trying to feed themselves to survive. So the middle class is important. You probably read about it when you did the quiz for the chapter of how they really begin to take control of not only communities and government, but also of culture, right? They set the standards of how society should dress, how society should behave by the 18th, 19th century. So in the Middle Ages, we also have new kind of technology emerging during this period. We have the universities, which become very important. Universities derived from the Middle Ages. They're important places of knowledge that preserve knowledge, that teach people. In the Middle Ages, particularly in the early Middle Ages, you have very few options. You can be a serf. You can, if you're lucky to be part of noble classes, you could be a warrior, right? A knight, have some fighting skills, and then sell your skills or go on crusades, or you could join the church. With the development universities, now there's a third option. Now you can actually do something with this education and maybe go into business or be a lawyer or an advisor to somebody, right? So there's more options opening up thanks to the development of universities in the Middle Ages. Another major innovation that happens during this period, now this will become key because books are so important. In the Middle Ages, they're very expensive to produce, but by the 16th century, they're beginning to be mass produced, and books will again revolutionize society, because you begin to have a community that is somewhat educated. Not everybody's able to read, but people want to read because they want to read the Bible, right? So the development of the printing press not only gives people the opportunity to read a text like the Bible, but also read other texts and produce texts. And we see that there, particularly by the Industrial Revolution, there's a lot of books that are being produced that focus on business and technology, right? And innovation. And not only do you need to be able to write it, but you need to be able to read it so you can keep up with the latest ideas of the era. So again, this is an innovation that happens in the late, in the Renaissance. There's books before, but they're just very expensive to produce. I think it is noted that we lost, 80% of our knowledge in the Middle Ages once the Roman Empire fell, because much of this knowledge wasn't preserved. So by the 1400s, again, things are being mass produced. Books is one of them. I mentioned, again, banks are an innovation of the Middle Ages. A lot of people kind of tie it to the Crusades with the, what's their name? I can't remember their names. Knights Templars, they're the ones who develop a bank. But then other, as I mentioned earlier, the super companies, they engage in banking. Also, you have a lot of what's called usury, right? People are lending money and charging interest. And I was listening to some lecture a long time ago that talked about how normally you would go to a guy on a bench to do some of these transactions, and he argued, so don't quote me on this, but he argued that the word banco comes from that idea, right? Bank, the word bank, because you would go up to a guy on a bench, and in Italian, the word for bench is banco, and that's where you kind of do the transaction. So if it's true, that's very fascinating, right? But I can't. This guy sounded pretty legit. He's a historian, so I would tend to believe him. But again, banks are being developed during this period. There's a lot of great innovation happening, but these are kind of, I'm just going to touch on a few. Glass. Glass becomes very important. We have in the Middle Ages, late Middle Ages, the development of cathedrals. So if you ever gone to Europe and seen some of these cathedrals, you have these big, churches with these big open spaces where all this light comes in, right? Well, you can't just have an open space. You need something to cover that. And that's where glass comes in, where you need a skill to develop glass, right? You need to be able to heat the glass and work the glass and create these pretty mosaics, right? These images. So if you ever get a chance to go to Europe, you'll probably see, if you enter some of these cathedrals and see some of these great glass work, windows, if you will. And they when they build these cathedrals, most people would have never lived to see the day of them being finished. You started, particularly if you started at the beginning, they would take about hundreds of years to complete, maybe 100, maybe a little bit more, maybe a little bit less. But, in your lifetime, you probably would have never seen it completed. Now, funding needs to come to develop these things, right? You need money, organization skills, right? You need all these things to make it happen. So all this technology is taking shape in the Middle Ages, late Middle Ages, to make a church that's so massive. If you ever stood next to the one in Paris, Notre Dame, I remember I felt like a little mouse inside of it because it's just so big. But again, these things become important. And not only do you have glass for churches, but you also have the development of eyeglasses. Because the print was so small when they made some of these books, some people couldn't read it. So glasses, again, opens up opportunities for people to read, right? And then later, you'll see with the scientific revolution, the development of microscopes and telescopes by the development of glass, and this opens a new window to other things. Understand that capitalism and the Industrial Revolution is tied to war a lot of times, and it's important to see how all this technology, scientific technology, and just even simple technology like this transforms the world at this time. And probably the biggest innovation that will have a major impact in the Industrial Revolution is the clock. The clock was invented about the 1200s. It was perfected by the 14th century by a guy named Giovanni di Dondi, who created a clock that was struck every hour so that way you knew exactly what time it was. So prior to this period, it's really the sun that determines your day, right? And as you know, sometimes days are longer, sometimes they're shorter, depending on the time of the year. With the clock, you can set a schedule on a daily basis that never changes, regardless of whether it's dark or light outside, and that is very significant, right? You're no longer tied to this kind of generic idea of what time it might be. Rather, they have given you a very specific time. Now, when it comes to the Industrial Revolution, this new technological advancement called, the clock or a watch, would change people's lives, because now your life is defined by it, right? The time you have to go to work, the time you have to have lunch, the time you have to have dinner, right? The time you go home. If at this time, if you're a woman, more likely you're a domestic person, right? So the time you got to have dinner ready by. And really, the way it begins to shape the worker is, how much can you produce within a given amount of time, right? So time becomes the enemy, right? At this time, the clock is a hero for this age. Later on, it becomes your your worst enemy, and we know this, right? Because if you ever sit in a class, you're probably just looking at the time to see when is this thing over. You're probably wondering about this lecture. When is this thing going to be over? Right? How long is it? How many minutes is it so I could go do my quiz or go do something else, right? So yeah, the clock changes everything for the Industrial Revolution, not just this period that we're talking about here. And another major development that happened in Europe during the Middle Ages is the Black Death. Now, the Black Death is significant because it facilitates the economic change that happens, and that basically shapes the way we kind of function today. So we can even look at something recent as COVID, right? Where COVID has transformed our lives, right? We see people quitting their jobs, and because they're tired of dealing with a lot of stuff, and they want better pay. Well, the Black Death, not only did it, was it a disease, but it had a major social impact where it transformed the fabric of society. Like something like COVID, probably Black Death had more of a major impact. But just to give you a few examples, about depending on location, about 50 to 60% of the population died, right? Depending where you're at. Some places it's less, but I think it averages between 25 to 50% of the population died in Europe. And we'll never know the total number because nobody kept records. But it is noted that within 4 years, between the 1349, about 38 million people died in those 4 years. 38 million people. Again, when we look at something like COVID in the United States, we're about 800,000, I think, which is sad, right? Nobody wants to see anybody die. But here we're talking about 38 million people. So when you lose such a large vast of your population, it's going to impact your markets. So we begin to see people, we see less people, so there's somewhat of a less demand, but there's still a need for food, right? There's still a need to clothe yourself, right? There's still a need for certain needs that society has, so people still need to work. Well, prior to the Black Death, you have that kind of serf labor where a person is so dependent on the Lord, and he can't leave the castle because he's not quite a slave, but definitely is forced to be there. Now with the Black Death and the need for labor, there's actually the ability to walk away from your job. And we see many examples where people say, the hell with this, I'm out, right? And they begin to leave the serf role that they had and begin to sell their labor. Again, that's a major transformation. That's something that we do today, right? Today you go to work and you're basically selling your labor to somebody in return for money. During this period, during the Black Death, this just makes it, facilitates it. It makes this shift from serfdom to wage labor a little bit quicker. Again, something like we saw with COVID, right? So just to give you an example, in England, in 1347, before the Black Death hit, somebody who worked the land would collect about 2 shillings. I'm not going to put that in today's numbers because I don't even know. But let's just, this is a specific example from that period. By 1350, this is a 3-year period, that same worker can demand 11 shillings. What's that? I don't know. Mathematicians, that's like 5 times almost, right? Of what you used to get paid. That's how much your salary and the need for your labor increased during this period, right? And nobody was happy about this. The aristocrats, right, the people who once owned these people, right, had them as their serfs, no longer could force them to stay. They try to create laws to limit their mobility, so they wouldn't leave, try to force them to stay there. But because, again, the demand is there, they could name their own price, and many of them um, left, if the Lord would not lower the rents. And some of them even asked for more freedoms. Now, this caused all types of chaos, but this period after the Black Death is known as the Age of the Worker. Not that things were great for the working class, but nevertheless, they could demand more when they sold their labor to different places. So why is this important to the Industrial Revolution? Well, like I said earlier, right? It transformed this idea of somebody being tied to a land to all of a sudden having value in the work that you do, right? Your physical labor has a value. And if you feel like you're not getting paid a reasonable amount somewhere, you can go somewhere else, right? And this is the development of the working class. So that's the Middle Ages with a little bit of the Renaissance there. Here we're going to talk about the Renaissance and really about how the world begins to open up. So the Renaissance, we're talking about 1400s to about 1600s, give or take, right? This is not a science, so it's a general time frame. But we see new things kind of emerge during this period. Number one, we see new economic centers. So earlier I mentioned that Europe didn't really matter during the Middle Ages, right? Constantinople was the place to be. It's sorry not to criticize anybody, but I mean, it's like living in Tonopah and wanting to be in Phoenix, right? Phoenix is where everything's happening. If you live in Tonopah or some little outskirt town outside of Phoenix, it's kind of dead there, right? That's what Europe was like in the Middle Ages. Now in the Renaissance, Europe is the place to be, right? Tonopah is the place to be, right? Bill Gates ever built that major city he was supposed to build over there. But you have these new centers. The Hanseatic League, which is essentially in northern Europe, places like Belgium and Germany and Netherlands, they become a major economic center now. And then you have the Italian areas. Again, they're still important because the Mediterranean is still an important place. And a lot of trade is happening in Italy. Again, they're the ones who are importing a lot of these goods from places like India in the Middle East and Africa into the rest of Europe. So Europe becomes much more significant than it did before. It's interesting because, just a bit of a side note, as Westerners, we believe that Europe was always important, right? You have the Greeks and you have the Romans, and we assume that it continues to be important. Well, not necessarily. In the Middle Ages, it kind of just disappears. It's there, but it's not that important. Muslim places were probably more important because they were trading with more frequency than the rest of Europe. So, Spain was probably more important than Germany and France in the early Middle Ages, 5th, 6th, 7th century, because it was controlled by the Muslims there, and they brought in a lot of kind of great technology and innovation there. But I digress. Right now, by the Renaissance, Europe becomes an important center. You have the revival of these old industries, and they're being redeveloped and moved somewhere else. So wool becomes very important in different places in Europe, such as Belgium. England, still very strong wool producer. You have obviously glassware become important places, develop in important places such as Venice. They used to do the glass in Venice, but then the town burned down one time, so they had to move them out of the city. If not, the entire town would burn down. Development of precious stones, jewelry becomes much more important because it's becoming not affordable, but definitely the upper class, the nobles, have a taste for these goods, right? Again, that's capitalism, where you're developing this need for, you're creating a market for a good that is not necessarily needed, but definitely wanted, right? You don't need a gold ring to survive, right? It's not that important. But because there is a larger amount and you have a class that can afford it, it creates a market. Printing, as I noted in the book, right, becomes very significant during this time. So people are selling books, people are writing books, people are reading books. But more importantly, war. You know, the nice thing about war is that it creates a market in Europe. And in Europe, you're always at war. So they're always fighting, right? 30-year war, Crusades, the popes call crusades on different people, country, the 100-year war. Everybody's fighting and everybody's trying to get the upper hand. So in doing so, you need technology, right? You need innovation so you could defeat your enemy. So, some people have tied the Industrial Revolution to war, right? To technological advancements in war, particularly weaponry, right? So war becomes very important to the development of Industrial Revolution, because particularly in the 100-Year War, where you have the development of gunpowder, right? That's not something that's indigenous to Europe, but rather it's imported through. It comes from China. In China, you don't have that many wars, so it never really took off. But the Muslims brought it over. I think it was used in Morocco or in Spain. I can't remember where. And then the Europeans found out about this, and then they took it over because, again, they're constantly at war. And you have development of cannons, right? And you want to make sure cannons don't blow up on you, so you need to innovate. So this technology becomes very important to the development of industry. Mining is nothing new, right? Mining has always taken shape, but they develop new techniques. And I'll talk about this a little bit more, particularly with the Industrial Revolution. Now, the new world, as I mentioned earlier at the beginning of the lecture, is that it just opens up so much. So much gold and silver is coming into Europe that it's just insane, particularly in places like Spain. They're the ones who are controlling the majority of the Americas, where most of this gold and silver is found. And, it's just creating this influx of gold that has never been seen before. Now, as I mentioned a minute ago, right, there's a lot of war in Europe. So the Spanish monarchy used a lot of this gold to finance their wars. So most of the gold actually went to bankers in, I think, Belgium or somewhere up there. I can't remember exactly where, but it didn't go to Spain, right? It didn't stay in the local economy. Not like everybody got a free gold bar in Spain. Quite the opposite. Most people, Spain went into experienced hyperinflation during this period because there's just so much gold in their economy and silver. And a lot of it's coming from the Americas, from Mexico, from places like I think it's Bolivia. There's this mountain over there that is said that you can the amount of silver that came from this one mountain in Bolivia could build a bridge from Bolivia all the way to Valencia in Spain of pure silver. That's how much silver was extracted from this mountain, and that you could build a bridge back of the bodies of the people who died extracting it, right? So it just kind of shows you how much not only precious metal came from the Americas, but also the toll it took to extract it, right? How many people had to die to fulfill the appetite of these Europeans who were just essentially raping the continent of any resource they can get their hands on. So not only are they taking gold and silver, but they're also, some places just don't have gold and silver, so they're also taking other resources. And at the beginning, I mentioned of how the global economy transforms Europe, and it goes both ways. Europe transforms the Americas, but the Americas definitely impacts Europe. So everything from spices, those are coming from places like India, right? Tomatoes transforms the Italian cuisine. Potatoes, that, and I'll talk about this a little bit later, but that just completely changes everything. In regards not just to food, but to the diet, what you're consuming. Chocolate, right? Corn, another major staple that today is, we use for so many things, like, everything from fueling cars to, create, what do you call it, to sweeten your soft drink, right? And to eat, right? Coffee, tea, oranges, tobacco, a vice that some of us might have, right? Porcelain that's being imported from China. So the global economy opens up to Europe some of these goods that were so exotic to them, they'd never heard of them, right? And I believe that you could probably use sugar as a form of currency for a short period of time, because that's how valuable sugar was. With it, with the plantations of sugarcane in places like the Caribbean, that begins to lower the costs, and now it's everywhere, right? I doubt you could take a sack of sugar and trade it in for a PlayStation 5 or something today. But it just shows you how much these goods transform Europe at this time. As I mentioned earlier, right, sugarcane, it was known in Europe. Muslims have brought it to Spain in the early Middle Ages. Cotton was a known product in Europe because it was brought over from India, I believe, but it just didn't grow over there, right? These things you cannot just plant these things and hope it would sprout. So many of these industries that were somewhat known but not heavily used in Europe were taken to the Americas, and it just exploded there. I mentioned sugarcane in the Caribbean, obviously cotton with the Americas, particularly the United States. And not only are people planting these things, but you need a labor to collect it, right? So this will spur in the slave trade. And here you kind of see somebody, right, who's a little bit darker than some of these indigenous people or these Europeans. So this development of exploration, quote unquote, of the new world not only brings in these goods, but it also, there's a lot of bad that happens where you have this development of the slave system. Now understand, this is important to the Industrial Revolution, right? Not only is the slave system important, but also the colonies, because without any of these things, the Industrial Revolution probably would not have taken off the way that it did. Earlier I mentioned about, again, the apple of Newton, right? All these things had to come together at the right place at the right time, right? Which is, again, when we talk about the iPhone, it just wasn't working in the early 1990s with the Newton. Same thing is happening here. All the different steps are taking shape to what will explode in the 1700s, right? All these things are coming together at the right place at the right time. Now, it's at the expense of different peoples, but nevertheless, it is coming together, whether you're a slave, whether you're poor, right? You could be European and poor. Understand that they suffer too, right? If you're a woman, right? If you're a child, right? There's all these people where you have this kind of ripple effect that it just could destroy their lives. You also have, I mentioned banks, right? But you also have joint stock companies where people are investing and being paid in dividends, right? So that way, they you know, people are moving up the economic ladder. So you're moving away from a society that's dependent on title, right? That you're born into nobility, into society that uses skill to move up in society, right? And for this example, it's economic skill, right? Do you have the funds to invest? Do you have the tech to innovate in a new industry for a good that already exists, right? T-shirts already existed, right? Pens already existed, shoes already existed. Can you come up with some way to build a better mousetrap, as they say, right, in business? Right? That's basically this. All this is, right? Building a better mousetrap, because many of the products that are being developed during this period, particularly in the textile industries, are nothing new to this period. It's just that they're making it more efficient. And as the world begins to open up, as it begins to take colonies, as people begin to make money, as you have a growing bourgeois, as industries begin to develop, nations begin to develop, right? Prior to this period, you have this kind of feudal system, right? These kings and dukes and duchess and so forth, right? Owning these small parcels of land. Now we're moving away from that, and now we're going to become more nationalistic, more like a nation. Not quite a nation quite yet, because that doesn't really come into fruition until the 19th century, at least the way we think of nations. But a lot of kings are looking at themselves as a cohesive piece of territory. So during this period, the state, the king, right, the monarch, begins to try to protect his local economy. As I mentioned when I talked about the Middle Ages, many of these entrepreneurs develop their markets near the lord's territory so they could be protected. Well, now the lord, and really the king, is making sure to protect their economic interests, right? Their entrepreneurs. So pay close attention to this, because this idea of mercantilism is developed during this period, where basically the state protects their economy against other states. So the French protect their economy against the English, and they protect against the Germans, against the Italians, right, against everybody else. Again, they're not really nations quite yet, but these big chunk of lands are making sure that they're doing everything they can to protect their economic interests. So a lot of it's almost like today, where you hear these ideas of, America first, or Russia's doing the same thing. Turkey, oh my God, they're doing the same thing right now, and they're kind of failing at it because their lira is, they're facing really bad inflation. Their money's becoming worthless to some extent. So you want to protect your economy. So how do you do this? Well, first you try to store as much gold and silver as you can, so you have those reserves, right? People are still dealing with coins, so that money still has value. But again, you want to have more than less. Number two, you protect your markets, right? If a French shoemaker is making some shoes, then you want to make sure that some foreign shoemaker from England is not undermining the price of shoes, because they can produce it cheaper. So what do? Well, you create tariffs, right? You tax the imports. That way your shoemaker is able to compete with a foreign shoemaker, and hopefully you buy the French rather than the English, right? That way you protect your market. As a state, you invest in your colonies. As I said earlier, right? These economies are being developed partly because of the colonies that they have. A lot of resources are coming from Latin America and China and India and so forth. So you want to invest in these places and protect them so you don't lose them, right? this is where the raw material is coming from. Let's take, for example, cotton, right? Whoever owns the cotton fields in the Americas is importing this cotton, and then in the in Europe, you import the cotton, you make the yarn and the fabric and the t-shirt, and then you sell it to other places, maybe back to the colony, right? You find yourself a market there too. So you see how important the colonies become to the states. You as a king, right, as a state, you support and encourage manufacturing by giving land, by giving special privileges to entrepreneurs, right? Whatever it needs to do to develop certain industries. You support trade companies, right? Particularly in different parts of the world. So you can create a monopoly in certain resources. And then the ultimate goal, really, of this concept of mercantilism is to export more than what you bring in, right? Again, it kind of resonates with that idea of America first, right? You buy American goods, but you also produce them in America so you can export them, and that way your nation becomes stronger, has more money, right? That's the theory, at least. Reality is quite different, but basically you have nation fighting different nations, not in war, but in economic trade. So during this period, we see how, not only are the aristocrats have this kind of taste for foreign goods, but also the different communities, right? The middle class begin to want some of the same wants that nobles had, right? If they can afford fine silk, well, now the middle class has the money to buy those same goods, and they could almost emulate the middle class, or sorry, the noble class, right? So things like pepper and spices, right? These are products that were unheard of in Europe, or only the richest people, really the nobles, were the only ones that had access to these goods, right? Now the middle class can also afford them, and they could buy things from not only other parts of the world like pepper and spices, sugar, which is coming from Brazil, tea that's coming from Asia, but they can also buy goods that are coming within the continent itself, such as wine, right? Which, if you're living in England, you could buy wine from France. I mean, there's such a close association when we think of wine in France today, right? You could buy some of the finest wool and some, great fruit unheard of in maybe Sweden, right? That you could buy it from Spain now. And you could buy silk from Italy, right? A middle class person can afford these luxuries. So we begin to see that the economy is becoming very global, which is something that resonates with us today because, our economy is very, very global, right? Today we buy things that are from all over the world, and I think most of us could probably care less where it comes from as long as we get what we want. So what are some other innovations that happened during this period? Well, we have a little bit later on, another revolution. Actually, we're going to look at a few revolutions in this slide. We have the scientific revolution, where you have an educated elite who see, again, Sir Isaac Newton's coming up with ideas, Galileo's coming up with ideas, Kepler and Copernicus, right? And it's like, well, great, these are great scientific ideas, but how does this help me as part of the educated elite? Well, you needed to make sure to connect the idea to a way to make money, right? So the scientific thinkers of the era needed to show, this is interesting that gravity exists, but how is that going to make me any money? So the idea needed to be profitable, right? It needed to be applicable. And one way that it was, just one example, is building bridges, better bridges to hold the weight of goods that are being transported at this time. The railroad tracks are right around the corner, so you need engineers. So it's good to be educated in some of this great scientific knowledge, but it's better if you can apply it so it can make you some money, right? So engineering, becomes a very important field because you could apply some of these ideas to the real world. The property elite also needed the scientific revolution to be applicable. So one way it was applicable to them is to use science to create larger yields of food in agriculture, right? So this became very important. It wasn't just about planting seeds and hoping something grows. It's about applying science to food production. The royal elite also needed it to help them, right? As I mentioned earlier, the mercantilism, right? The state needed to protect its economy. And I mentioned earlier about war too. Well, again, science is great if you're a scientist just for the sake of developing scientific ideas, but who's paying you to develop these scientific ideas? A lot of times it was the state, right? It was kings. There's a French academy that is funding great scientific knowledge. So they do this not just to develop ideas, but also to benefit the state. So a lot of times it was in relation to war. So a lot of great scientific ideas emerged that helped develop war technology, such as gunpowder, right? And which impacted ballistics, right? And Louis XIV made sure that the knowledge that his scientists were producing was protected and did not escape his kingdom, because England could take the same technology and now use it against them, right? So it became very important that, yes, science is great, but it needs to benefit society, or really the economic market. And those are just kind of different ways that it benefited these different sectors of the population. Another revolution that you have around right before the Industrial Revolution is the population revolution. We see a growth of population. You have a population that's more literate. So not everybody could read, but we talked about people being educated. They were even promoting free access to education because they know a literate population is a better population. So I think in Germany they were advocating for at least some free education to the population. In some places, not everywhere. But we also see population growth, and we can see this is just an example. I think this is in Europe. Population grew in a very short span of time, right? It went from 120 million in the 1700s to about 140 million in the 1750s, to not quite double, but a good 2/3 of it by 1790, right? 190 million. And just to give you some specific numbers, in most places it nearly doubled. In England, the population went from 5 million to 9 million in the 18th century, in the 1700s. So it just shows you how quickly population was growing. And in doing so, you need to feed this population. So food production needed to be ramped up. And again, it goes back to this idea, right? That food production was tied to science, because now you need to develop more food to feed this growing population. And we find that the death rates began to decline because the food that Europeans were consuming was much more nutritious than prior periods. And again, this ties back to the old world. So just to give you an example, the potato was a very important food staple because it was high in carbs and rich in vitamin A and C. So it allowed people to, be healthier. And the food, potatoes actually last a long time, where you can store them, for the winter. And it's a very nutritious food source. So much so that the Irish and the Polish and the Germans, and I can't think of who else, but everybody had some form of food dish, excuse me, that was connected to 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 potatoes. Another revolution is the agricultural revolution. So during this period, there was an ice. In the year 1000, the climate got a little bit warmer, and then it got a little bit colder in the 1700s. By the late 1700s, the little ice age was essentially over. I'm not sure if anybody here plays the violin, but there's these very famous violins. I think they're the most expensive ones in the world, called the excuse me if I butcher the name, the Stradivarius violins. They can fetch millions. Now, it is noted that they were produced during the Little Ice Age, which is what gives them that rich sound. That's one of the theories as to why they're so valuable, because you can never reproduce those ever again. Now, there's a debate about the sound quality and all that stuff, but nevertheless, just a little bit of a side note that those very famous violins were developed during that particular period. But really, after this Little Ice Age, things warmed up a little, so it meant that you had more food resources, so more livestock was available. And having more animals meant having more, not only meat for people, but also more manure for the soil, so to replenish itself, which allowed for higher yields of food in Europe at this time. So you see how all these things are kind of being tied together. And as I mentioned earlier, right, that the scientific method is being applied to the food production. So just to give you an example, Jethro Tull, an Englishman, he used a hoe to keep the soil loose, and this would allow the soil to basically get air, and so moisture can reach the plants that he was planting. And then he tended to grow things in a row, more like the way we grow things today, right? When you're on the freeway, you could see these rows of vegetables along the side of the freeway, and that's the way he started growing food rather than just scattering seeds everywhere. And this is, again, not only is it more scientific, but it helps produce food in a better method, because now birds are not just like pecking at all the seeds and eating all your seed and all that kind of good stuff. So again, they're applying innovation to food development. And we also begin to see people moving away from small farms. Right now at this moment, people are still living in the countryside, but because you begin to see large-scale farming, people begin to leave the rural areas and move into cities. These concepts of like open fields or community gardens are beginning to disappear, and you begin more kind of large-scale farming taking shape. So this is, again, part of this revolution that's taking shape, and kind of having these, it's not quite corporations, but just large landholders farm this land, and those people that once kind of farm their own piece of acres, small little acres to survive, are now being pushed off that land and having to go out into villages or towns and look for work there, and no longer are supporting themselves. So now they're working for money. So again, this agricultural revolution, it's debated whether it really took shape or if it didn't, but it doesn't really matter. The point is really that large farms are being are taking over, and the small farmer is essentially disappearing, right? The guy that kind of plants his own food, milks his own cow, just does enough to survive year by year is disappearing to some extent. Not completely, but somewhat. We also see certain industries that are changing. We see that, again, this is one of these, because we're talking about such a large period of time, it's so debatable, but these industries are being transformed. The Industrial Revolution kind of brings everything into the town, right? Into a big factory where all these things are being produced in a factory, right? If let's take, for example, fabric. You take all the steps to make that fabric into the factory. Well, right before the Industrial Revolution, and actually, everything before the Industrial Revolution, they used what's called a putting out system. And basically, somebody will bring you a bunch of raw cotton, right? And now you have to make it into fabric. And then when you have it done, he'll come pick it up and bring it to his factory. And this is what's called a cottage industry, or in the process itself is called a putting out system or the domestic system. And what would happen here, basically, it's small independent mom and pop, not shops, but just mom and pop homes all over the countryside would take in the cotton. Mom and the kids will make it into, kind of clean the cotton and make it into a yarn. The mother and the daughter might spin it into a thread, and then the father and some of the kids will make it into a cloth, and then the guy who gave you the raw cotton will come back for the cloth and clean it up and dye it at his factory or something like that. So you have a lot of industry. This is like pre-industrial revolution period, right? You have a lot of industry happening out in the countryside. Now, notice how time consuming that would be, right? Having to go to these different places to collect the fabric, and you're basically doing it on your own time, right? A lot of these people did it just to make extra money. Well, that system is still in place, and it kind of continues into the 1800s, but it begins to lose out to the factory system, all right? And it's important because a lot of people became dependent on this putting out system. A lot of the family became dependent, right? Everybody contributed in some of these steps to make this fabric. But as the Industrial Revolution begins to take shape by the 1800s, this system begins to kind of collapse, and now everybody needs to move from the countryside to the city and now work at a factory. And another kind of revolution that's taking shape is the cotton revolution. So prior to this period, most clothing was made out of linen or wool. If you know wool is made out of sheep, right? They kind of shave them and then they make them into a yarn and into a fabric and so forth and so on, right? Now, that's expensive because you have to maintain the animals, you have to, it's harder to work with. And cotton is a little bit easier, right? And you could grow it in large quantities. So cotton begins to replace wool because wool could not compete with cotton. I mean, you could only have so many animals in Europe, and I think it was a 50-to-1 ratio of how much cotton was being produced versus how much wool was being produced, right? And it just can't compete. It's also cheaper, as I said, right? You don't have to feed cotton, right? Besides water, right? Whereas animals is more of an upkeep. So cotton, it's also it's a better product. Not only is it cheaper, but it's better to dye, right? Better to work with, and it grows quicker than wool would, right? So you're able to make more with it at a quicker, more of a quicker turnaround with cotton, and it quickly replaces wool as the major fabric of the era. Now understand that part of it is being produced by slave labor, so it's cheap because of the slave labor too. It's coming from the Americas. and they're producing great, beautiful products, great dresses and capes and hats and clothing, where again technology is emerging to replace these old industries. The water frame, you could Google it. It's I might maybe I'll be able to put a clip, but it's the water frame is able to produce more yarn than a family ever could, working by hand. And in doing this technology begins to replace that kind of physical labor. So the flying the water frame, the water frame, which is a flying shuttle, sped up the process for weaving, which meant that you needed more yarn to be produced so you could create more fabric. So that putting out system could no longer really compete with this new technology that's being produced. So much so that people from the putting out system actually complained to the companies that use the water frame, saying, "Look, you're going to put me out of business because it does the work, I think, 20 times faster than a person doing it by hand." So you can begin to see how this technology begins to replace physical labor, and it's something that we know today very well, right? Technology replaces labor right now. Once I create this lecture, it's there for life, right? And I'm no longer needed, right? So technology allowed me to record this, and I could be fired and easily replaced by somebody else monitoring the class, right? So the same thing is happening here, where these poor workers are saying, please, don't use this machine all the time because we just can't compete with it. So we see how in this kind of pre-industrial revolution, this technology is coming in to replace some of this workforce. And I mean, it doesn't get rid of them, but they need to start finding other work to do in order to stay afloat. And then you have, I kind of briefly mentioned this earlier, but I'll mention it again, right? This kind of consumer revolution where people are buying these goods. So I talked about the noble class initially in the Middle Ages. They were the only ones that could afford luxury items. But now the middle class and even some of the, what do you call them? The merchants and kind of lower middle class people, and even some of the poorer classes, the working class, can afford, particularly by the late 1800s, can afford some of these products, right? And they're getting things that are, again, these are needs, these are not wants. But even think of undergarment, right? We, all of us use, underwear, right, for the most part. And, prior to the Industrial Revolution, most people could not afford such luxury items, right? Now, people could, because it's being produced at a fast rate. There's so much cotton available, right? Cotton fabric available, that people can actually afford to buy underwear. So it's such a revolution that, again, it shapes our desires, right? Now people want these luxury items and are seeking them out. Who would have thought that underwear was a luxury item, right? But at this time it is. So it transforms society in many ways. I'll go through this kind of quick, but you have these new industries emerge. So you need a power source to fuel this energy for the Industrial Revolution. And back to my kind of overall argument that England was a place to be, because not only do they have an empire where they are able to get cotton from the rest of the world, right? They have a surplus of labor, but they also have the this raw material that helps fuel the Industrial Revolution, and that is coal and iron. So if you ever work with charcoal is hot, but coal is hotter, particularly when you convert it into what's called coke. It burns at a higher temperature and it lasts longer. Charcoal is made out of wood, so it just doesn't burn as efficiently as coke. And in England, they have large deposits of coal, and they also have a large deposit of iron. And iron becomes an instrumental resource for the Industrial Revolution, and everything to building the machines that the Industrial Revolution needs to create mass production, to the transportation of these goods from place to place. So iron becomes an important resource, that transforms England and the Industrial Revolution. So they're able to produce it like cleaner, a better source of iron to produce things that I'll talk about in a minute. So the steam engine, and the book talks about these things, so I won't spend too much time, right? Developed in England by James Watt, I think he's Scottish. The flying shuttle, right? Again, I won't spend too much time here. The mechanized loom, here you kind of see them, right? Producing these looms to create fabric. You see this little girl over here? Her job, everybody was employed, the father, the mother, the child. Her job was to collect whatever fell. A lot of times cotton would fall in there and everything could be reused. So this machine would go back and forth. And the timing of it was never exact. So it was a very dangerous job to be this person right here collecting this, because there was the possibility of the machine coming back and pinning you and killing you if you got caught in between. So it was a very kind of cat and mouse situation where you had to run and get out of the way so you wouldn't get stuck and basically squashed to death. If you happen to get stuck and died, unfortunately, you were easily replaceable. A lot of times it was your fault, not their fault. Right? There's no what do they call OSHA back then to help you out in any of these things. So very dangerous job, right? Again, the mechanized loom is there. You see it. And then you had the development of canals. So in France, you see them now. You could take boat tours in France. But at one time, they were used to transport goods from one part of the country to the other. England had them too. The United States had them too in New York. But a major innovation of the era was the rocket, really the train, right, which was created by George Stephenson or perfected by George Stephenson, where you're able to transport large quantities of goods, right, pulling them from major industrial centers such as Birmingham, such as Manchester, such as Liverpool and Leeds, to places like London, right, to these different parts of the country. And that, again, this is really the Industrial Revolution at its height that's happening here. Now, we'll kind of sort of end with this last slide where we look at really the culmination of all these things that I talk about in one place. And it is in England at the Crystal Palace where they create this beautiful glass and steel building to house many of the goods that were being produced during this period. And this really showcased the triumph of England and the Industrial Revolution that, for lack of a better word, they created, right? So I really kind of talk about, again, it's made out of glass. It was first established, it's kind of like a World's Fair. It's first established in Hyde Park, and then it gets moved, and it just deteriorates after that. But it's kind of like a World's Fair where people from all over the world come to see not only the goods that are being produced, but some technological advancements of the era. There you get a picture of what it might have looked like inside of it, right? And, it really kind of showcases man's dominance over nature, so much so that they even put a tree inside of it, right? And I mean, if you look at the cathedrals of the Middle Ages, which are made mostly of stone, and you compare it to this cathedral, right, of the Industrial Revolution, which is made mostly of glass, it's just such a contrast, and it just really kind of showcases this awe-inspiring authority of the Industrial Revolution, right? So it's quite amazing of how they were able to create this, and this just like the blueprint of what was there. And they brought goods from India and from the New World and so forth, and it's just you spend hours like going to a museum there to see what was in at that time. But really, the Crystal Palace and the Great Exhibition of 1851 was really for Britain to show off to the world that they made it, right? They were at the top of this Industrial Revolution hierarchy, and this building really did a great job showcasing that. All right, so in conclusion, what do we learn? So again, the Industrial Revolution wasn't new, because as I try to show, ever since the Middle Ages, different communities are innovating ways to develop products in a faster way, right? So it's not anything new, but it was happening way before the 1800s. And try to show you the different steps that it took to develop this. And innovation was really cause for mass production. That's ultimately what they're trying to do, right? In the Middle Ages, they're trying to mass produce, cloth just as much as they were doing in the 18th century. Obviously the technology existed better in the 18th century, so they can reach larger markets. But in the Middle Ages, they were trying to do that. But that's ultimately what the Industrial Revolution is. Can you mass produce a good, right? And how do you do that? Well, like we said earlier, you build a better mousetrap, right? And that's what they're doing here. And then lastly, we see England's, development of the Industrial Revolution be the culmination of all the different things that happened before, from obtaining colonies, right? Obtaining slave labor, obtaining resources within their own kingdom, right? Coal and iron, and then developing innovation, right? Such as some of the great tech that was developed by some of the English, I think they're all men, right? Englishmen, to create the factory system. So this becomes very symbolic, right? The Crystal Palace becomes very symbolic of what England was all about at this period. So here we end with this image of a factory system, and understand that, just to kind of end, again, there's so much I can talk about, but I just don't have the luxury and time. But, the factory system was really about the middle class controlling their labor, in the putting out system, he would show up when they tell him, yeah, we're done, come pick it up, right? In the factory, the entrepreneur can control not only the production of the good, but the life of the labor, right? And I'm gonna maybe have an activity where you look at some of the rules that people had to follow when they work in some of these factories, where it is, you probably know, because you work at you probably have a job where, again, the clock becomes your enemy, right? You get docked for being late. You get docked for this, you get docked for that. And there's all these restrictions of what you can and can't do. You can't drink while you're working anymore. Like, what the hell, right? So, all these rules begin to be implemented in the factory, where your employer can control every aspect of your life. And again, this filters to the rest of society, where, even housework becomes industrialized. And if you take my women's history class, I give a whole lecture on that too. So then the question is, how do people react to this new system? And the reading does a good job addressing this too. And again, maybe we'll have a discussion about that subject too. All right, so we'll end it there. I know it's pretty long, but hopefully you feel like you learned something new that you didn't, that the book didn't provide, or you just didn't know. And make sure to do that quiz.